the imperative of regional integration. The S ultimately of BRICS should not stand for South Africa. It should stand for SADC. This is a regional area of approximately, 260, 270 million people. We are bigger than Brazil. We are bigger than Russia. We're bigger than perhaps the second tier, the Indonesias, the Mexicos, the Turkeys of this global economy. The imperative of regional integration is certainly there. Since Goldman Sachs created this BRICS type acronym, big is beautiful for capital. Big is beautiful. All the leading economies, and this argument we've had almost post-December, when our government was invited to join the BRIC grouping by our friends in Beijing. The discussion debate has been, do we belong? Do we deserve to belong? The economics don't seem to justify it. Well, I think it's certainly beyond that, but ultimately to justify it, we need to integrate our regional economy, and that is SADC, and also to be sufficiently attractive to capital in the global economy, and the new global economy, if I say, going forward. Now, what we're seeing here is and some of the questions, Tamisi, you've listed around, how does business, how does government, how do DFIs, development finance institutions, align to this new force of BRICS coming to the continent? I think, firstly, we're seeing new models of finance, something which Mary Lou, I'm sure, will pick up on shortly. How does business align to the state capitalist play to varying extents of BRIC actors in Africa, particularly referring to the Chinese and the Brazilians here? India's engagement is more diffused. Russia's is more, should we say, expedient around resources. But how does business play or get access to a state capitalist force coming into the continent? I think that's a key question. From a Chinese perspective, and China's certainly the biggest letter in BRICS when considering our region. In August last year, Jacob Zuma, our president, was in Beijing on a state visit. During the course of conversations, I believe from my Chinese friends, that almost the conversation went along the line that China will be or should become our partner for regional integration in SADC. Now, a recent study by the World Bank, Mary Lou, which I was partly involved in, found that over 51% of all Chinese finance coming into Africa to date has gone into the power sector, which is the absolute fundamental of growth in any economy. So we're seeing, from a Chinese perspective, I'm jumping around here, time is very tight, I recognize that, is that we've seen in the last 10 years what I call the new coupling is Africa's growth, which is relatively robust, 6.5% perhaps. The IMF always somewhat understates it in sub-Sahara. But I fear we're becoming almost drunk on growth to an extent in our own region. We're applauding ourselves as governments, often forgetting 6% plus, which is no mean feat. We know that. But what have we actually really done at a regional level to drive or deserve the 6% plus growth? It comes to what I call the new coupling, where sub-Saharan Africa's growth is largely underpinned by Chinese demand for commodities and resources, be it the pricing is either because of real or perceived demand coming out of China's side. In a similar fashion, as these trading links of commodities become more entrenched between China and Africa, so we will see that a component of China's growth becomes dependent on Africa's ability to supply those commodities. Now, if you accept that new coupling, it's an absolute no-brainer as to why the Chinese are putting literally tens of billions of US dollars into infrastructure finance into this continent. Now, it's quite ironic that perhaps the greatest force for region integration in our own region will be an external force, i.e. in China. Perhaps decisions being made and implemented in Beijing are perhaps more impactful than those being made in Gaborone through the SADC Secretariat. I think that's a point to certainly consider. The last thing is that about which of the key projects one should look at, and it was mentioned earlier about corridors. One of the most important corridors now is one which hardly anyone knows about, is the corridor, the first ever effectively, to an extent, east-to-west infrastructure corridor in sub-Saharan Africa, linking the sort of west coast of Angola through to the southern part of the DRC, rail corridor being built by the Chinese. We've seen credit facilities to the tune of $15.2 billion put into Angola. $6.5 billion now being spent on infrastructure in the DRC. Why spend such sizable amounts of money if you cannot get the commodity out? I think that infrastructure corridor is both very disruptive from a South African perspective, because effectively it cuts us off. But if you're Angolan or Congolese, it's extremely enabling. And I think we need to look at this as a regional play as opposed to perhaps a selfish South African play. Chair, my recommendations briefly to conclude is from government perspective, this disconnect we have in this country and other countries in the region, but particularly pronounced in South Africa, this disconnect between government and private sector impedes our ability to project the interests of SA Incorporated in our own region towards enhanced, smoother integration efforts. I think that needs to be narrowed as much as possible. From a business perspective, recognize this shift. Network, meet with new actors originating from the BRIC business communities, and how to break into state capitalism. We certainly can do it. I think it's around collaboration. There's always an option of competition, of course, but ideally collaboration with these sizable financiers, infrastructure players in our own region coming from BRICS, particularly China and to an extent Brazil. Lastly, from DFIs, development finance institutions, let's lose the politics. It's very different. It's very difficult, should I say, for DFIs, I'm observing externally, is to align to the interests of BRICS in Africa because of the politics. The value proposition is there. It most certainly is. But coming back to the disruptive or new models of finance coming out of likes of Exim Bank of China, Bendes out of Brazil, truly developmental finance for infrastructure plays. Perhaps, and I've said this before, perhaps there isn't enough or hasn't been enough D in IDC or DBSA in recent years. And I think the models are certainly coming from the new world as opposed to the old. As Jeffrey says, the rich countries will be putting money in Africa. The rich countries are now the BRICS, no longer where you used to think they are. Thank you.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.